where she's able to have a greater understanding about her family life, vis-a-vis especially her mother. And so at the same time that she is stepping into this autonomy as a knitter, she's also embracing her past. Hey friends, hey sister knitters, brother knitters. Welcome to another episode of Life with Fife, a podcast that focuses on knitting, the connection between knitting, and the intersection between knitting, creativity, spirituality, independence, autonomy, and our mood and how we feel about ourselves and how we go about our lives. That knitting, put very simply, the rhythmic action of knitting and the quiet time that we devote to our knitting allows us to transcend, to quiet negative thoughts, feelings of anxiety, is somewhat of a mindful activity. And that by doing this over and over again, that we return to the center in ourselves, which is based in creativity, which is based in goodness, and which lends itself to a happier, more productive life. So if that sounds like something that you would like to be a part of and listen to and to partake in our community, please do hit subscribe. Please give me your comments below. I love to get comments and I love to respond to them. And I love to hear from listeners about what you're doing, what's working for you, what books you're reading, what you're knitting, whatever's happening in your life. So today we are going to we also talk about here, one of our favorite subjects is to talk about Elizabeth Zimmerman. We love to talk about Elizabeth. Elizabeth kind of encompasses this mindset of owning your own knitting, of being the boss of your own knitting, this autonomy that helps us to kind of take ownership over our creativity. And when we take ownership over our creativity, our lives can actually change, because we can, by having the courage to approach knitting from a different perspective. I mean, I love to follow patterns, and I often follow patterns, and this is not a disparaging statement on patterns or anyone who uses patterns. But when we get to the point in our knitting, as some of us are in the beginning of our knitting, as I was when I started out as a knitter, I didn't know how to follow patterns. And using Elizabeth Zimmerman's books, I was able to create garments that were beautiful and showed skill that I kind of didn't have at the time. And you know, we're used real wool and weren't overly, the directions were not so technical and so so technical that I just felt out of my league and I would give up. So her descriptions, her methods, the tools that she gives us in her books gave me the courage that I needed to transcend my beginner knitting. I knew how to do a knit stitch and I knew how to knit on straight needles. But that was about it. And she was able to move me into knitting in the round, knitting and following basic instructions that gave me the freedom to then not only create a sweater, but make a hat, make all of these things and do them over and over again. So I refer very often to The Opinionated Knitter. This is my favorite book. This is the book that actually really got me started on her system and was just so helpful to me. And it's a beautiful book. You can get it at Schoolhouse Press. I'm not affiliated with Schoolhouse Press or Elizabeth Zimmerman's company, but I love to refer people to them because I think it's a wonderful company. I think they're very helpful. They have excellent products. Their prices are very good. They have good service. So I got Opinionated Knitter there. Opinionated Knitter is a collection of Elizabeth's newsletters that she sent out to her customers when she started her home business of selling yarn and help and being in touch, creating it wasn't an online community because it was done through the mail, but by creating this sense of community among knitters and this sense of ownership over knitting. So today's podcast is going to be about Elizabeth Zimmerman. We're going to talk first. I'm going to spend some time on just a short amount of time on a technique that will help to improve your knitting. I'm going to talk a little bit about Elizabeth's books, and then we're going to move into some details about her life that are really, really fascinating and that you may not have heard before, because Elizabeth is really, there's not a lot of information about her out there. And there are some books that she's written. Knitting Around is a book where she talks about her life and she talks about her experiences and what led her to various stages in her knitting. So that's what we're going to talk about. But so I'm also going to refer to Knitting Around, which is another Elizabeth Zimmerman book that I absolutely love. Absolutely love this. And this is each chapter in this book. This is such a great really, really great book to have for a beginner knitter as well, because you can just simply learn. She has finishing techniques, she has casting on techniques, she has recipes for seamless and yoke sweaters and how to attach the body and sleeves, and it's done in, her language is always extremely matter of fact, extremely direct, so you never ever feel like you are lost. She talks about color pattern knitting, and I'm going to just read a little bit about what she says about gauge. Now, first, for all of us, this is the technique portion of our podcast today. Experienced knitters know about gauge. You must know about gauge because you can't even follow a pattern without having a sense of your gauge. But gauge is equally important for those of us who want to do a more recipe-focused kind of knitting. So let's see what Elizabeth says about gauge. The size of the needle can determine your gauge. Your state of mind can influence your gauge. In short, gauge is an idiosyncratic matter. Some knitters knit more tightly than they purl, or vice versa, so that their stocking stitch, if worked back and forth, may have alternately tighter and looser rows. In fact, the whole subject is fraught with frustrations. Let's try and simplify it. First, work as often as you possibly can round and round on a circular needle, and thus avoid the pitfalls yawning for those who knit and purl at different tensions. Second, don't knit when you are in a rage or tense for any reason. At least you can knit, but confine this to working on very tight, strong pairs of bodies or of booties or a sock. Keep them in a special place and take them out only when angry or peeved. Third, test out your gauge with given wool each time you start a new project. Okay, so this is like just really basic, and you can hear how, her just person to person, her very, very matter-of-fact way of writing informs us. And then, so basically, I'm just going to show this really, really quick image. This is what we need here to see our gauge. We're counting our stitches along an inch. We do a 4-inch swath of fabric, counting how many stitches we have. And then we also do a measurement of the rows. So we have a sense of the fabric that we are working with. It's very, very important. And I'm just going to show you an example of when I started out. I'm just going to speak really frankly, I don't like to do a gauge swatch. I find I'll be all ready to sit down with a project. I have my yarn, I have my instructions, I have, whatever, everything is all set. The last thing that I want to do with my beautiful yarn that I've ordered just for my project is to take it out and knit what I think is a useless piece of fabric, right? It's the last thing that I want to do, but I just want to show you what can happen if you do not do a gauge. So this, again, this is a sweater that I knit that is an Elizabeth Zimmerman percentage system. And you can see I did not do a gauge swatch. I estimated my gauge. And I have a sweater that I absolutely love. I love the colors. I love the yoke work. I'm extremely proud of. And I really only wear this with several shirts underneath on very, very cold days. I might even put a sweater underneath it and go outdoors where, it's just such a bulky sweater. My husband could wear it, except he doesn't like the colors. For him, there's a lot of pink, and men can certainly wear pink. He just doesn't like that. And it's also a little short for a man's sweater. Like my husband prefers his sweaters to hit a little bit lower. So this is a sweater, an example that I spent many, many hours knitting this sweater, probably, 40 hours, right? At least knitting this sweater. And it's not really put to good use. I don't wear it as often as I should because I didn't take one afternoon just to determine my gauge. So it's really, really important. So now what I do when I am getting ready to sit down and do my knitting, I look at the instructions. I see what the recommended needle size is. I take out my needle. I use the yarn that they recommend, or at least I use the size yarn that they recommend. If it's fingering, I will use a fingering weight. If it's worsted, so on and so forth. And I start off by knitting a good size, maybe depending on the needle size and depending on the yarn. I try to knit at least a 4-inch long piece of yarn back and forth until I have about 10 rows. And then what I do is I take out my ruler and I look at the stitches and I see approximately where I'm at. The correct way would be to remove it, wash it, block it, and then measure it. But I don't take all those steps in the beginning. And my tension, as Elizabeth mentions, my tension is fairly equal on knit and purl. So I don't have a lot of gaps in my knitting. So I can do this. If you are that kind of knitter, you can do this. You take your measurement, and then I actually, if the measurement is, if I'm supposed to have 4 stitches per inch and it shows 4 stitches per inch, I will start on my sweater. I'll start on my neck, and I will do that. And I will continually measure as I go along, and I don't get too far along before I realize that I either have gauge or I don't have gauge. So if you are experienced enough to do that, if you're a strong enough knitter to do that, strong enough tension, meaning like if your tension is maybe strong's not the word. If your tension is equal for knitting and purling, and you can knit a good size swatch back and forth without having gaps, you can do this. And if you're able to, then when you cast on in the round and start your knitting, stop and take a look at your yarn, and you're willing to take a chance. And if it's too big, too small, go back and restart. Then that's a way that you can save some time on gauge stitching, gauge swatching. So that's my little secret. That's how I do it. And I'm going to now get into the details of some really, really interesting details about Elizabeth Zimmerman's life. So again, I'll just quickly say a few words about Elizabeth Zimmerman. I found her to be, as I mentioned earlier, she helped me so much when I started my knitting journey. She gave me the formula that I was able to make a sweater without being able to follow a pattern. If I was better at following directions, I would still have a beautiful sweater to this day. And I still do have a beautiful sweater, it just doesn't fit me. The fit is not perfect. But it's not Elizabeth's fault, that's my fault. I went from being someone who could not knit beyond a simple scarf that was knit, purl, or I could follow just a few little stitch designs on straight needles, to someone who could create a garment in the round. And then over the years, as I kind of did that, it gave me courage to move into patterns and take risks with patterns and take on patterns, and I've been able to do that as well. So she helps the beginning knitter to grasp hold of a technique or a skill set that they may not fully have enough yet to do, that they may not have enough technical knowledge to get through reading a pattern. She gives them the ability to create a garment. For the advanced knitter who might be yearning to personalize their knits a bit more, or to create knits, make just enlarge knits, or decrease the size of knits. She gives you that power as well, because she teaches you the formula of how, if you know your gauge and you know your measurements. In her books, she gives a very, very simple percentage that allows you to do this. And so what I really love Elizabeth as a knitter and as a human being, because she is about owning your knitting, being the boss of your knitting, that you never feel that you have to go to someone else or pick someone else's brain in order to figure out how to do something. So, and that is why so many people do love Elizabeth, not to mention that she is such an engaging and charismatic figure. Okay, so Elizabeth was born in England. She lived in England with her family, who she was born around the end of the Victorian age and sort of the emergence of the industrial period. And it was a challenging time for her family, because her family, which had money during the Victorian times, we don't really know the details why, but we know that her family lost a certain amount of income, and they did experience some financial struggle during that time. So Elizabeth's family, Elizabeth's mother, who was an enterprising woman, started a business, the first of its kind in England, and it was kind of like what we would say Meals on Wheels, what we're familiar with here, but it was the first of its kind, and it was really handy, and it was really successful. It was quite successful. However, this was not taken by Elizabeth's family to be, they were not, like today we think like, oh, that's so entrepreneurial, that's so, how amazing your mother was able to kind of just get out there and do what she needed to do. This was a bit of a source of shame for Elizabeth, because it was so anti the Victorian ideals of womanhood and all of that. So Elizabeth struggled with this in her childhood, and she talks about it in her diaries, and she talks a little bit about it in Knitting Around. And I'm going to link where I got this information from. There's a woman who wrote a PhD about Elizabeth Zimmerman, and I listened to an audio podcast and got a lot of this information from her. And so Elizabeth had this conflict. There was this tension at home between what her mother did and the kind of life that she was placed into. So as a result of her mother's ability to make money through her business enterprises, Elizabeth, and also that she made an agreement with the boarding school that Elizabeth attended, that she would bring in more students for the school. Elizabeth was able to attend a very well-respected boarding school. And so she was part of the upper class community, and was exposed and part of a really excellent education. She had access to all of that. However, there was always this conflict, because she was not truly part of that group like others, as you can just imagine. When you don't fit in financially, it can be a real strain. So that kind of colors Elizabeth's childhood, yet she is able to spend time and to learn to become a really good knitter at a young age. She has governesses, and she has access to excellent education. And this will help her in the future as she goes out into the world, working as a knitting teacher and kind of having access to families with money. She was able to fit into this world fairly easily. And so she always kind of like walks this fine line. She's someone who is really capable of occupying various worlds and various societies, and that is due to her intelligence and due to her desire to I don't know what it really was her desire for, but she has this desire to succeed, desire to have a good life, to have ease in her life and have happiness, and she sort of learns how to manage these kind of two worlds that she's in. So in about 1936, she had met Arnold Zimmerman, some point earlier, I believe, on a ski vacation. But she reconnects with him in 1936 and hears about a harrowing escape, or a very narrow escape, that he has from the Nazis at that time. And it is at that time that they decide to marry. Neither family was very particularly happy about their choice to marry a foreigner. Arnold was from Germany, Elizabeth was from England. I don't know what the conflict was between the families, but there was some sort of unhappiness on either side with their choice of marrying foreigners. And so they decide to immigrate to the United States in 1937, which they do. And in 1939, and they moved to New York. They land in New York, and in 1939, Elizabeth's first son Tom is born. In 1940, her daughter Loie is born, and in 1942, Meg Swanson, who is of course famous in her own right for her own knitting and for running Schoolhouse Press, is born. And they stay in New York until 1946, when they move to New Hope, Pennsylvania, where Elizabeth becomes part of an artist colony there. This is a very vibrant, inspirational artist colony, somewhat famous. George Nakashima, the furniture maker, is part of this artist colony, this artist group. Julia Child later is part of it. It's a place where they talk about, where there are not only knitters, it was songwriters, poets, painters, all kinds of artists, cooks, so on and so forth. And it was mostly an immigrant community, or a first generation, immigrant community too. And so Elizabeth kind of was still living in this European world, somewhat European world, that celebrated art and intellect. And she was kind of really, this period of time was really, I imagine, I don't know, but I can imagine this must have been a very fun period for her, and a time for her to really kind of dig deep into her creative side. And she talks about, there are some diaries that have been found, I'll link all the information below if I haven't said that already. She talks about in an essay written around this time about the three cultures of knitting, that Elizabeth now is starting to get some perspective on her life as a knitter. And she spent some time in England, she spent some time in Germany, and she spent some time in the US. And she said that in England, she felt that knitting was as one knit as one breathed, that it was a very natural act, and that she was, she felt to be the boss of her own knitting. And it was just a peaceful, pleasurable activity that she did. Then when she spent time in Germany, she found that there was an entirely different culture in Germany about knitting, and that it was based on following directions. That the shop owner, that you went to the yarn shop owner, and the yarn shop owner would create a pattern based on what it was that you wanted to make. And you needed to follow those directions that the shop owner would create for you. And this was, Elizabeth jokes that she never realized what a bad knitter she was until she was in Germany trying to follow the directions. And she said that she just really learned how to follow patterns here, that this was a period of time where she became an excellent knitter, that the Germans were really master knitters, and it was, she really, really learned a lot about her knitting, about following patterns and following technical instructions, and this would serve her later as well. And then when she came to the US later on, she found that it was also a completely different culture of knitting, that the US had, the knitting store owner was not going to be the expert, that often the patterns that you would find in magazines or in the knitting store had bad directions. And there was a general lack of expertise. The other thing that was happening was that it was harder to find wool, that rayon was being introduced, and that knitters were encouraged to use these, what Elizabeth viewed as inferior, and I think we view them still to this, and I think now we kind of look down on using synthetic blends, although I know that we use them in socks and things like that, but knitting an entire sweater out of completely synthetic yarn isn't done as much today. But that was, and so Elizabeth was frustrated. She felt frustrated with the lack of expertise. She felt that there was, in the American community, that it was a sad life for knitters. The American knitter didn't really have very much to go on. If they couldn't follow a pattern, if they had problems with the pattern, the knitting store owner wasn't necessarily able to help them, and they didn't have the skill set. They didn't have those skills that they could actually take control of their knitting and make something of their own. So here's the first, I think, something really interesting. She sees something lacking in society, and she decides that she's going to try to do something about it. And mostly because she wanted herself to improve on her knitting and to continue to knit in the way that she did. So it's at this time where she starts to develop her own sense of her own abilities, and she says, this is a time when she makes, there's a quote by her at this time where she says, that one might want to experiment with using one's own brains rather than picking the brains of others. And so we see this emerging sense of autonomy and independence starting to happen in Elizabeth. It's during this time that she makes the Tomton jacket and other really, really kind of iconic patterns or designs that she makes. And it's where she starts to experiment with getting her designs published. It's also simultaneously and interestingly, coincidentally, the time when she starts she develops either, it's unclear, it's from her life notes, from her journals, that she spends some time with someone, either a family friend, a therapist perhaps, someone who was just, I don't think that she ever went to church, so I don't think it was a pastor, but somebody close to her. She starts to develop a relationship where she's able to have a greater understanding about her family life, vis-a-vis especially her mother. And so at the same time that she is stepping into this autonomy as a knitter, she's also embracing her past and coming to terms with it, having a greater understanding of her mother. And this seems to open up when they move to, they are in this all seems to happen during this time when she's in the New Hope, Pennsylvania community. It's also at this time where she starts to want and desire greater autonomy in a very real way. She starts to think about knitting in ways that people have characterized as critical knitting. And she wants to have numerous cast-ons. She wants to have a cast-on that's correct for when one wants a stretchy kind of cast-on, or when one wants to pick up stitches and then continue, move on. There's a correct cast-on for that. She starts to think about, well, what kind of neckline do I want? Do I want a yoke? Do I want a raglan? Do I want set-in sleeves? Do I want drop shoulders? This is really where she starts to focus heavily on techniques and design and being the boss of her own knitting. And it's at this time, around 1949, when they moved to Wisconsin from New Hope, Pennsylvania. And now she is really part of what is, as opposed to the artist colony that she spent time with in Pennsylvania, she's now part of a real knitting community. And she talks about how during these years, her children would go to school and she would spend time at the local yarn store, and she would share her techniques. And of course, anyone who knows Elizabeth knows that she has this very engaging way, and one can just almost imagine her coming into a knitting store, sitting down and sharing an enjoyable afternoon, probably teaching, I imagine, other knitters how to do the techniques that she has honed at this point. And by 1950, she starts her own business in Sherwood. She starts to import, this is the time when we start to see her starting to sell her designs, being frustrated with how design magazines will change her design from something in the round to a flat knitted piece of, based in dressmaking design as opposed to her style of knitting. So there's this frustration that develops. She is, and so she's continuously she's able to import yarns from Europe. During these years, she's able to get into the Wisconsin Design Crafts Fair, which is a highly regarded art fair. She's able to bring knitting into a very serious craft fair. She's kind of like really working to have knitting be taken more seriously, and gaining great successes personally, right? She's by 1960, by the 1950s, there's not a ton of information what's going on in the early 50s to 1955, but by 1955 she is selling designs to Women's Day. By 1960, she's talking about her television show. She's writing. She's doing lots of writing, her books. She has her newsletter. She's importing this. She has her European wool company. And here we can wonder about Elizabeth in 1960, because honestly, we don't know about Elizabeth, and I certainly am not going to venture what kind of thought process that she had about kind of negotiating who she was as a woman in 1960. She was a housewife on the one hand. She was married to a professional man. She had 3 children. But at the same time, here she is writing these books, getting into into these highly respected craft fairs, selling yarn from her home, writing these newsletters, having a thriving business, and thinking about being on television. So lots of people, it would be tempting to kind of say that she must have been a feminist, or she must have had feminist aspirations, but actually her words do not reflect that. She doesn't really, she mentions that she's not a joiner in any kind of movement, that she doesn't like to be a part of things like that. She says at one point that she's a masculinist. She really disdains feminism, and that she's a proud and happy housewife. So there's this kind of like paradox, right? We have a woman who kind of publicly says these things, and then almost privately downplays. She does not want to be known as an artist. She doesn't really own that, that she doesn't want to own that she's a business owner. She constantly refers to herself as being retired and having fun, and she and her husband are camping and doing all these things, but meanwhile she's doing all these professional activities. So we can only wonder about how she negotiated these identities within herself, and what her ideas about womanhood were, and how she kind of spoke about it in her private life. To my thinking, it seems like Elizabeth was someone who was a practical person and wanted to get from point A to point B with the least resistance. That's my interpretation. I have no idea. This is just me speaking about her. And so I can imagine that she didn't really have a need. Why would she, pick up the mantle of women's liberation or feminism, those kinds of things, when she was able to access all the freedom and autonomy that those movements brought women? So by being quiet about it, by downplaying it to some extent, she was able to kind of reap the benefits of that in a quiet, sort of non-invasive, non-disruptive way. She was able to maintain her family life, and at the same time do what she wanted to do. So that's my interpretation of Elizabeth, and of course I don't know, and if any of you do know, have more to say about that, I'd love to hear about it. Because she said that she felt liberated by being a housewife, that she was having so much fun, and so at the same time she was able to be a creative person and maintain all of those identities without any of them stepping on the toes of the other. So she was such an amazing woman. I'm going to continue to talk about Elizabeth in various ways in the next couple of episodes. I hope you enjoy this. If you are with me still, I hope that you please hit the subscribe button, be a part of this community where we will talk about Elizabeth more. And we're going to be talking also about other knitters that you might find interesting, such as Barbara Walker, I can't think of her name. There's a few other knitters that I have on my roster that I'm researching currently that we will talk about, who have changed the face of knitting, as modern knitting as we know it, and have something to teach us about knitting today. So I hope you enjoyed this. Hope to see you again soon. Namaste. Have a wonderful 4th of July weekend.